right, and we are officially recording. All right, now we have 73 people on the line, and Shara, I think I'm gonna, the number just keeps going up. Shara, I think I'm gonna give it to you.
Okay, I'm gonna give it one more minute and then say my intro. Welcome everyone. I'm so glad to see the interest in our subject of habitat connectivity today. My name is Shara Ragland. Just a bit of background. This panel was originally part of Colorado Parks and Wildlife's Partners Conference in April, but that was sidelined due to COVID-19. Since then, the panel has changed a bit to have a broader focus. You will hear about the biological side of habitat connectivity as well as the cultural side. Both have to do with healthy, connected ecosystems. I want to thank our host organizations, Great Old Broads for Wilderness, with chapters across the state of Colorado and beyond, and the Endangered Species Coalition. I'd like to turn it over to Haley Hawkins from the Endangered Species Coalition, who has a few acknowledgements she would like to make before we begin. Haley?
Thank you, Shara. I want to take a moment to read something that all of our host organizations have come up with together before we get started to make sure we have it in mind as we speak tonight. Okay, now we recognize that the North American conservation movement is built on a foundation of racism and exclusion, which continues to this day. In Colorado, we live on lands that were stolen from the Ute, Arapaho, and Cheyenne nations. People of color are often not safe or welcome in outdoor spaces to this day. The systems that drive exploitation and conquest emerge from the same seed, whether they relate to people, land, water, or wildlife. Just as we fight each day for the protection of wilderness, wildlands, and a livable climate, we must fight against racial injustice and against a society that perpetuates ongoing daily inequities in healthcare, education, wages, voting access, safe outdoor spaces, and an endless array of other ways our society imposes systematic discrimination. Our work to protect natural areas must ensure healthy communities and climate resilience for all people and all species. We must work to transform ourselves and the attitudes that still pervade the conservation movement. We can't have justice for all without a healthy environment, and we can't have a healthy environment without justice for all. We acknowledge that there are voices missing from tonight's panel. This panel does not represent the end of the conversation, but the beginning.
Thank you, Haley, for those acknowledgements. I hope that we all keep this in mind as we listen and discuss the topic of habitat connectivity. I appreciate the time and sincerity of our panelists and our organizing team. Thank you for joining us. Without everyone's voice, this is not an effective conversation. This afternoon, we will briefly hear from 5 panelists representing how they perceive habitat connectivity and what they see as the challenges and opportunities for this topic. We will hold questions until all panelists have spoken. If you think of questions as we go along, if you'll go to the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should see a Q&A box, and you can type your questions in there. and they will stay in there until we've heard from all our panelists, and then we'll move into the question period. Let's see, if you would like to direct your question to a specific panelist, please put that in with your question. So we have lots of time for questions. I'm going to start with our first speaker, Galen Guerrero Murphy. And Galen is the Land Conservation Program Manager with the Colorado chapter of the Nature Conservancy. He leads land protection and conservation projects across the state with an emphasis on grassland conservation in Southeast Colorado. As director of the Emerging Southern High Plains Initiative, his strategic focus encompasses neighboring High Plains states and conservation planning and finance more broadly. Galen is passionate about furthering landscape scale conservation that benefits nature and people. Galen, take it away.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and it's really a pleasure to be able to join this panel today. As you mentioned, I'm the Land Conservation Program Manager for the Colorado chapter of the Nature Conservancy, speaking with you all today from my home in Denver. Unfortunately not out in this beautiful grassland ecosystem photoed here, but that is typical of the sort of landscape I've been working in recently with the Nature Conservancy. Prior to joining the Nature Conservancy, I did a lot of work on habitat connectivity with some of the smaller critters. And I don't know if y'all have ever encountered a turtle crossing a road, but it's really heartbreaking to see, especially if it encounters a curb on the other side that it can't get up. So this is a photo of a very common snapping turtle out east, really halted at a curb cut here. Not a species of conservation concern, but certainly an issue for habitat connectivity. The photo on the right here is a underpass for another turtle species, the rare spotted turtle in Massachusetts, at a new commuter rail project that I was involved in, not only for spotted turtle, but for all the small critters that really can't get past a railroad track, in this case, two wetland ecosystems connected for this new rail construction. So while historically I've done a lot of work with these smaller critters, reptiles and amphibians out west and out east, more recently I've been thinking and working with the Nature Conservancy at slightly larger scales. Here is a map that I wanted to share with everyone, visualizing species movements due to projected climate change. This is not a map I was involved in creating, but you'll see a little reference. Dan, a colleague with the Nature Conservancy, who helped create this with the University of Washington, to really exhibit how species will be expected to make very significant changes in the face of changing climates. And with climate change pressing upon us, habitat connectivity has certainly kind of taken on a new meaning. This little bullseye in the middle here, the Southern High Plains, is where I've been focusing a lot of my efforts lately, parts of southeastern Colorado and neighboring states, often looking at kind of larger landscape connectivity issues around larger species migrations and climate corridors. Clearly, we know the need for habitat connectivity is as pressing as ever. This little article I've thrown up here is a 2016 study that demonstrated that only 41% of natural lands in the United States are currently connected enough to allow species to track their preferred temperatures as the planet warms over the next 100 years. So clearly, as we think about climate change, connectivity is taking on new and very significant meaning. In Colorado, we're really blessed to have a wonderful wildlife and wild lands, but increasingly these are at odds with our growing population. Kind of love this photo of the pronghorn meeting a new suburban development in Colorado Springs, where clearly we're having to address and embrace challenges in habitat connectivity with our expanding population. In the places I have been focusing on, renewable energy development is a topic that's front and center in our minds. This is a little article stating, Colorado's southeastern corner has enough wind potential to power the rest of the state, but lacks the high voltage transmission. This is great, and we're seeing a lot of new renewable energy development, and the Nature Conservancy and our partners really embrace and understand we've got to advance the deployment of renewable energy, but how might we do that to minimize impacts on habitat fragmentation and intact natural landscapes? And we know there are great opportunities to have win-wins here, where we have accelerated renewable energy deployment and low impact development. So lots of challenges and opportunities. These are just a few takeaways I kind of wanted to share in my intro. Work at the smallest to largest scales is really critical, whether you're escorting a salamander across the road or thinking about climate corridors for the continental United States. We really need all hands on deck for habitat connectivity. Reconnection and restoration for both people and nature is really essential. In urban centers and rural centers, there's a lot of reconnection and restoration that needs to be done for us all and for biodiversity. I do a lot of work on private working lands. This is a photo of a ranch I work to protect in southeast Colorado. If we're talking about large scales, private and public land conservation really needs to go hand in hand together. Clearly, climate's a game changer. We all know that. When we're thinking about habitat connectivity, though, there's a lot of great new tools and planning documents and planning methods to think about how we might prioritize our work in the face of changing climates. And then this final bullet, we as a conservation community really need to engage more actively across differences for long-term success. So with that, I will close. Really, again, appreciate the opportunity to be here and look forward to talking more with y'all.
Thanks, Galen. Our next panelist that we'll hear from is Taishya Adams. She's a servant leader with over 25 years of experience at the intersection of education, health, workforce, and environmental justice. At Outdoor Afro, Taishya works with about 80 leaders in 30 states to connect Black people to outdoor experiences, changing the face of earth tending and environmental justice. At Colorado Parks and Wildlife, Taishya serves as one of 11 commissioners, setting policy for Colorado state parks and wildlife management. And at the American Institutes for Research, Taishya collaborates with diverse stakeholders to strengthen access, representation, and meaningful participation. Taishya is committed to dismantling barriers, addressing bias and privilege, and working in collaboration to forge a new legacy founded on liberty and justice for all. Taishya, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you again for having me. No, I know that the virtual setting is challenging. However, going back to kind of what I wanted to talk about today, intersectional environmentalism, it actually becomes more accessible to a whole group of people who cannot go to a meeting across town in the middle of the day, or, and again, it also allows for extended learning. So again, I know that we've had some challenges, but know that because of these challenges, we actually have more opportunity to deepen into the content, really build those bridges across the sector to address our common challenges and forge ahead. So as mentioned, Taishya Adams and my slides will become available. So this is less relevant for the people listening to me today, more relevant for the people who are not with us today. But again, I just wanted to share, my personal identities, and you'll see a long list there. And the point of that is, I sit at the cross section. Obviously a human, the tie that binds, the being, the tie that binds, but also a daughter, a sister, a earth tender, as mentioned before, African-American, a breast cancer survivor, womanist, anti-racist, and a global citizen. But again, all of those different identities, those experiences provides a perspective that is unique. And we'll talk about how important it is to have multiple perspectives when approaching the type of complex challenges that we face today. Some of the talents I bring to the table, community building, organizing, research and evaluation, and really from that participatory perspective, a athlete, a weaver, creator, etc. Service levers. You'll notice I didn't say job positions because I don't tie my value to how much I get paid to do something. And so I have here a list of things, some of which I volunteer and some things I actually make money doing. I would say I have expertise in all of these areas. However, and again, as mentioned, one of the commissioners for Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and that was really my entree into this level of discourse and discussion. You know, obviously, as a outdoor recreationalist my entire life, hailing from Virginia, where, you know, we didn't even call it like going to a park, and you just go outside, don't come in until the light comes on in the street, and then come in, but go outside and explore. And that was my start to this. And so imagine my surprise when I come into this space, and I'm often only the only Black person or African American in the room. And so to have this context where I know my family and my friends and my community cares about the outdoors and wildlife and corridors and connectivity and all these things, we might not have the language that we're using today, but the concepts are the same. But then I enter these spaces where some of the most important decisions that we can possibly make as humans around land, you know, earth, water, fire, the elements, you know, earth, wind, and fire had it. Another example that this is very rooted in the African-American experience. And then coming here and then seeing the lack of African-American peoples and others, in my indigenous peoples, my Latinx peoples, you know, and of course my Asian Pacific Island people. All of the peoples on this planet need to be on the decision-making table when it comes to these elemental issues. And so you'll see some of the levers that I use to try and remove barriers, but also not only reform, but reimagine. And that's what we have an opportunity to do every day. And I believe that is what this great cause has provided us. Again, I just wanted to go back into reminding in this work. You know, I was recently diving into, again, my role with the commission. I'm a year in, and so you know, I'm trying to build my knowledge base. I come to the Partners in the Outdoors conference last year, tremendous. Go to a lot of sessions, reading a lot, listening a lot, and again, I'm not seeing Black people. I'm not seeing Black voices. I'm not reading about Black scholars and scholarship. So imagine my surprise when I start to, you know, transition more into this work, and I'm starting to see, oh wait, you know, there are Black people who care about the planet as well, and have been fighting for not only the planet but the people on it. And so that's really where that intersection of, you know, the environmentalist piece, caring for the planet, and that stewardship, as well as the social piece and the cultural piece, and understanding that there are certain cultural conditions that have resulted in the disproportionalities you see right now, and that the fight for diversity, the explicit call out, the call out that I'm making today in 2020 is a call out that was made in 1990 by a group of Black environmentalists to the top 10 environmental organizations in the country, saying, we're here, we're qualified, we have the experience, where are the opportunities? Why is there a green ceiling? And so I come to this space really again from that in that intersectional place. And I was struck by an article I read that was titled, Why Every Environmentalist Should Be Anti-Racist. And by a young Black environmentalist, and this is her quote. It's just, I stand beside white environmentalists calling for climate protests, but I felt abandoned by my community during acts of unjustifiable violence towards Black and brown people. I have had enough. The time is now to examine the ways Black Lives Matter movement and environmentalism is linked. Ultimately, I come here today to say we all need to be a part of the solution, and that means we need to be a part of the decision making. And so she gave some options, and as I said, I'll share my slide deck so you can go in, and there's an intersectional environmentalist pledge, there's a book of poetry that you can read, and even a podcast that she offers. And so, you know, you can learn more there, but I really appreciated how she defined that intersectional environmentalism and some components that I find are missing when I read connectivity plans. oftentimes when it talks about community or stakeholder engagement, it's very general. It doesn't tell me, you know, the demographic of the community, what are the power structures within the community, how are the most marginalized, how are their voices being amplified? That's not a survey, that is not a focus group, and that is not an interview. That is not decision making. That is, I'm providing, it's a courtesy. Decision making is being at the table where we decide this is the connectivity project we want to do. This is why we want to do it. This is how we're going to do it. This is who we're going to do it with. This is how we're going to pay for it. This is how, you know what I'm saying? Like, there needs to be along every step of the way. That's how explicit the call for inclusion is. And so, you know, again, I go back into my own, you know, to build my own understanding of how do we get here. And then I come across Dr. Taylor's work. She'll be a professor at Yale School of Forestry and Management. Soon I think she's coming from Michigan, but I was surprised to see this 2014 article as I hear these calls now, these renewed calls for diversity, and it's exciting. And people are asking me, like, what can we do? And so I'm looking, right? Because I want to know, well, what does the research say? Because that's my AIR, American Institutes of Research. And you always find out what the research says, and then you find out what the gaps are, who conducted the research, who paid for the research, who analyzed the research. All of these things are things that I investigate to find out, again, the validity and reliability of whatever is being produced. I know I'm coming down, so I'm coming to an end. But again, just helping, knowing, I felt compelled to share about this particular study. And again, the slides are there. You can read them at your leisure. There's links to the study, but key findings was this green ceiling. And that's what I see a lot more diversity. When you look at the organizational chart, it goes like this, and that's the same way the diversity of racial and ethnic and gender diversity, or racial and ethnic primarily, looks exactly like that as well. And so how do we, again, amplify those voices that have been historically marginalized in a way that is very empowering. I hear a lot about implicit bias training. That is wonderful to hear. So again, right, go into that unconscious bias, but I will argue there's a lot of conscious bias that is happening that sadly we need to confront as well. And then another key finding is the lackluster effort and disinterest in addressing diversity, which is to say, I've seen a lot of solidarity letters, and that's awesome. And I also would love to see, by some others, a coupling of direct action that is meaningful and that really rebalances the power dynamic. And that's scary, and I get that. But that's really, you know, when we're talking about the inclusion and really including peoples as a part and stakeholder engagement, it's really revisiting those traditional power dynamics and seeing, you know, whose voices are not at those most important decision-making tables. So then I close with some recommendations that she has that I would still stand behind around tracking and transparency. So again, coupling a statement with actual data collection and accountability. Again, addressing the unconscious bias and overhauling recruitment options, not just recruitment at early stage, but also mid-career. Accountability, of course, again, integrating those diversity goals into performance evaluations of all leadership, I would add. And then lastly is resources need to be allocated to specific diversity initiatives. Notice they did not say these two, tracking and accountability, are a part of it. That's just core work, organizational work that needs to happen. I don't need a training to do these parts. There's things that we need to hire in these core competencies and start to value them as much as we value wildlife that we're trying to conserve and protect and serve. That is how highly we need to value this work of diversity and inclusion, because ultimately, if you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is tied up with mine, let us work together. But I could not agree with Lila Watson more strongly. Thank you.
Thank you, Taishya. Our next panelist, Nick Court, published one technical book and more than 50 peer-reviewed research articles as a geochemist He has been the conservation chairman for Grand Valley Audubon for more than 2 decades and led a Western screech owl project that has engaged several hundred Grand Valley citizens. His volunteer work in the conservation community culminated in his being the 2015 recipient of the Richard J. Levitt Award, awarded by the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. This past July, Nick received the William Dutcher Award from the National Audubon Society for his leadership in the birding community of Western Colorado for over 4 decades, and his continual voice for the environment, birds, and the conservation challenges they face every day. Nick, thank you. Take it away.
Are we all set? I guess after that introduction, it's not going to be a surprise that I'm going to talk about birds. You probably heard the data over the last several months that 3 billion birds population in the United States have disappeared in the past several decades. I've looked at that as this is the sort of thing that has happened in my adult life. And to take a better look at that, let's look at the next slide. You see there's 3 lines there. The blue line shows a 1.5% decline, red 2.5%, green 3.5%. And I took this data from the Cornell University website, and I really want you to imprint this on your minds, because what it's showing is that these bird populations are in a slow, long-term decline. This isn't something sudden, it is long-term, and if we don't arrest it, if we don't stop it, they'll just continue to decline until populations are too small. And if I can make this personal, the blue line, which includes about a 50% population loss in those decades, includes and there's the broad-tailed hummingbird. If you have hummingbird feeders up in the mountains, maybe you've noticed a few less. The next line, the red line, has the common nighthawk in it. Remember playing over ball fields when you were a child, and you were always seeing these sometimes called bull bats that would fly over the fields. They're 70%. And I was surprised when I looked at the long term at more than 80% declines, because besides the sage grouse, we see our state bird, the lark bunting. Another one that's, I live in the western slope, as it's been noted, the pinyon jay. That used to be the sound of the pinyon juniper forest, not so much anymore. Well, what happened? Some of that you can see on the next slide. I used sage grouse as an example, although I could have used several others, but the second box, habitat degradation and fragmentation, and that's it, fragmentation, connectivity. The next box shows that a sage grouse may need a very large piece of habitat. But it's a lot more than that. Let's talk about the next slide. And I'm calling this a hanky-panky effect, because some years ago it was thought that if you figured out, which is easy enough for ornithologists and birders to do, that a pair of birds needed a territory, let's say of a 1/4 square acre. Well, if you saved a 1/4 square acre, they'd nest, but they don't. And there was originally thought that this was predation, maybe kids with guns, things like that, but no. What we've learned is that most neotropical migrants literally are obsessed with extra pair sex. If they don't have the opportunity to switch partners with their neighbors, they won't nest there. I have a friend who has an orchard here, and he has shown that the black-chin hummingbirds nest together. And they do a lot of this because they do a lot of extra pair trading. And if they don't have the opportunity to nest by neighbors, they won't nest. So that means, and as the next slide will show us what we've done, we have chopped up the habitat too much. As my bio shows, I've spent a career or my volunteer career doing conservation work, and how many times have I seen a drilling pad and associated roads judged to be insignificant, or a logging project, or maybe getting closer to home to some of us, bike trails, hiking trails, but many small changes over a long time results in a huge change. What are we going to do? Well, the next slide gives some of that. People do have to stay on the existing trails. You know, we all think that, but every time you go off a trail, you cause damage. And maybe the next box there should have been the whole slide. I think we have enough off-road trails because we cut up habitat, we cut up places for birds to nest. As far as I'm concerned, we have no alternative but to stop logging unless it's for forest health. Drilling for oil and gas has to be on existing roads phased out. And where I live, we have a lot of nest box programs, and there we find obviously that the birds use ditches, ravines for their corridors, for their highways. So if we burn them, if we get rid of them, we get rid of the ways for birds to connect from one habitat to the next. So we need a lot of major change in how we are addressing our use of the environment and our personal expectations. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Our next panelist is Amanda Clements. She's an ecologist by vocation and avocation who's loved the outdoors since her youth. She's a board member in the Uncompadre Watershed Partnership. Most recently, she's been developing a small business, Applied Biological Services, that aims to reconnect people with nature via custom books that interpret the natural world on pieces of land ranging from private holdings to parks and public lands. Amanda, it's all yours.
Thanks, Sarah. Before I get started on my slides, I'd like to just take a quick moment to acknowledge Michael Soule, who was one of the fathers of conservation biology and one of the people who founded the idea of connectivity and its importance for conserving wildlife. And sadly, he passed away a month or two ago in Colorado. And unfortunately, you know, he wasn't feeling too optimistic about the state of things since he had been active coming up with these ideas in the 80s and 70s. So here's to Michael Soule, and let's hope that we will make him proud over the next few decades. I'm going to open up my slide here. So I believe something's not working with conservation. The goal is to save swaths of nature, the good things that come from it, and charismatic species for the long term. But why is it such an uphill battle? Every year, more foothills prairie is developed, sage-grouse leks are winking out, there's dwindling water for aquatic species, and more forest is lost to mountain pine beetle. We've known about connectivity, the cores, buffers, and corridors approach to conservation for more than 20 years. But in spite of hard work by the conservation community, it seems like there's limited attention and limited money for connectivity-based conservation. And more things are falling apart. So what gives? We know that nature is a system that's more than the sum of its parts. I visualize it as a cloth densely woven of plants and animals, microbes and other things that maintains its species and does the big and little, jobs we expect from the ecosystem. Nature has constructed this cloth to be strong through eons of evolution and adaptation and to make the most of Earth's resources. This is the cloth that produced the air, water, and wildlife we think of as our birthright in Colorado. But each piece we humans have cut out and repurposed for our own needs has lessened its capability and weakened the remainder by removing this species or introducing that weed. What happens to our birthright now when so much cloth is removed that only patches remain and the whole thing is about to be thrown in the washer with climate change? Why doesn't the public get this vision of habitat connectivity, the need to surround ourselves with connected chunks of nature spread across the landscape, enough to sustain species, sustain migrations, a safety valve for the inevitable climate change, and along the way produce the clean air and water that we need and moderate the climate for us? The things that entertain and inspire us and keep us sane? How come the public doesn't see this? Maybe the public doesn't get it because we professionals and practitioners haven't got a firm grasp on it ourselves. Haven't we stuck with a single species focus for deer, elk, bighorn, bear, pollinators, cheatgrass, endangered species, and the latest cause? Don't we, as much as the rest of our culture, see ourselves as separate from nature, up and above it, thinking we can figure it out and simulate its mechanics instead of trusting that intact nature will always do a better job? Instead of continuing to beat our heads against the wall, maybe it's time to examine our baggage. We all come with it. And the two largest pieces, in my mind, are our culture's deeply dismissive view of nature and our professionals' mechanistic instead of systematic approach to solving its problems. Until we deal with these, there won't be much progress. But maybe on a more optimistic note, my first suggestion is the terms, including the term habitat connectivity. Let's let go of it and its associations as our conservation driver. We need to find terms and messages that are more inclusive of people and ecosystems to switch our perception of being divorced from nature to a perception of depending upon it. And we also need to reframe wildlife and land managers' views from species-centric to ecosystem-oriented. And a lot of that rests on the terminology that we choose to use. My second suggestion, advertise, educate, and spread the message to the public like any good marketing firm would do. Think big. Think about advertising during something like the halftime at a Broncos game. That's what everybody else is doing. Conservation and spreading this vision needs to be using these same tools that the rest of our culture relies on. My third suggestion, let's bring other conservation, wildlife, outdoor recreation, youth groups, and other like-minded outdoors-oriented organizations under the message umbrella and unify regional efforts toward landscape scale conservation. Everybody's individual objective is furthered when ecosystems are healthy and connected. And my last suggestion, we need to consider all lands fair game for some level of ecosystem functionality and use existing tools, from conservation easements to leased in-stream flows, to rooftop gardens, to restitch the fabric together. Let's let no opportunity go to waste. And I am sad to say that I really believe this. Until we address our cultural perceptions, we won't make substantial progress. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you, Amanda. Our final speaker or panelist is Carl Ford of Denver. He's an environmental scientist and retired from the Bureau of Land Management. His interests are in natural history, public lands conservation, and climate change. He will compete the Triple Crown of the Appalachian Trail, Pacific Crest Trail, and Continental Divide Trail, and the Colorado Trail. Is that all this summer? He's active in the Colorado Mountain Club as an instructor and in conservation, and is a board member of Wild Connections, a conservation organization in Central Colorado. Carl, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And it's really a privilege to be with you guys today. Actually, I've already completed all that hiking. I'm still hiking. I probably won't ever quit. I just made a few notes before I launch off here, having heard other folks talk, that occurred to me that I wanted to share, just one in particular. I'm a grandfather now, and I often wonder what kind of legacy what environmental legacy I'm gonna leave for my daughter, my son, my granddaughter. And so that's why I'm active in conservation, and that's why I joined the group Wild Connections. Just a short introduction, and I'm going to show some slides here in a second, but Wild Connections has been around for 25 years, and we basically operate in the central Colorado mountains. It's the upper Arkansas River Valley and the upper South Platte River Valley. You'll see a map in a moment here. So the mission of Wild Connections is to identify, protect, restore wildlands, native species, and biological diversity in these watersheds. And in 2006, we developed the Wild Connections Conservation Plan. And I want to step back for 1 second and mention that back in the day, 25 years ago, 15, 18 years ago, Michael Soule was also involved with the ancestor of Wild Connections, which was the Southern Rockies Ecosystem Project. And a lot of his guidance and mentorship helped us develop this Wild Connections Conservation Plan. It's a really major effort. It's probably, I don't know, several hundred pages with dozens of maps done in GIS work. But it's a little bit dated, being now 14 years old. The goal of it was to identify public lands suitable for wilderness and important wildlife areas in our geography, which again is the central Colorado mountains. The plan, although I think it's a great plan, it's totally silent on climate change. And so it's been a focus of ours in the last couple of years to begin to update the conservation plan to address climate change. And specifically, we'd like to identify refugia and corridors. And don't look at this grid for a second here, but just kind of follow along. I know you probably can't read the fine print, and I don't need you to. But just basically, I want to summarize it by saying that we are using GIS, that's Geographical Information Systems, spatial layers on wildlife corridors, various layers on species richness and rare species, sensitive wildlife areas that have been mapped by Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And so we've accumulated probably, oh gosh, I haven't counted them, but over a dozen of those types of layers. We also, so that's up here in this part of the matrix. This came out of a paper that was commonly called the Yale Framework that was published by Schmidt et al. And it's kind of a seminal document that we've been using. And so those layers I just mentioned were related to the biodiversity. For large intact natural landscapes, which are really important for wildlife corridors and connectivity, we used roadless areas within our geography that have been mapped by Wild Connections and Rocky Mountain Wild. And then for the geophysical setting, basically what we're looking at here is how mountainous is the terrain, how dissected is the terrain. And the idea here is that the more dissected the terrain is from high to low, there's going to be a number of ecological niches for wildlife, and there's going to be streams and riparian areas that will be important for wildlife corridors. And also, we're finding that there are cold air pools, areas on the landscape where colder or cooler air sits longer throughout the day, all year long. And those areas we think are going to be more likely to be persistent refugia as the climate warms and dries. And so we have also mapped those layers relating to the geophysical setting. And then we also have gone to Colorado Parks and Wildlife and other sources like NatureServe to map every data layer that we can find on connectivity for wildlife. Unfortunately, a lot of it's for big game because that's what Colorado Parks and Wildlife does mostly. but we have tried to map all of those layers. And then I'm going to skip down. We really couldn't do a lot here with the resources that we have with item 5 here, which is map areas and manage areas in their future climate space. It's more of a species level kind of mapping that we didn't have the resources to do. Plus, we're more interested in landscape level effort here. And kind of the final goal here is to identify and protect climate refugia. So this is a work in progress. And here's a map of our area. And just to kind of get you acquainted with the geography, this is Denver up here, if you can see my cursor in the upper right. And immediately south is Colorado Springs, Pueblo, and Walsenburg, all on I-25. And then I've spotted also for you a star over here for Leadville, for Fairplay, and Salida. So we're pretty much east of the Continental Divide and, and south of the Highway 285 corridor. And so this is a preliminary map that we've developed of these refugia. And at the moment, I have wilderness areas highlighted in green, both Forest Service and some BLM as well. And this is an overlay, if you could think of it, adding all those layers together and to identify or map those areas that we think are important refugia and climate corridors for wildlife. Over on the left here, I'm not going to read all these, but basically these are some of the largest, highest ranked public land areas. And so you might be asking the question, so what? The idea here is we are going to advocate for their protection. Just like Wild Connections has advocated for protection of areas since its published plan in 2006. Now we have an additional thing to advocate for, not only important wildlife areas, but also why they will be important with the coming climate change, which is actually ongoing. And this is another map, the same base map. I've unchecked the wilderness areas green. But basically, this is kind of the idea of migration corridors for climate. We know that animals and vegetation will be migrating and are migrating northward, and also elevation-wise or altitudinally. And so we want to try to identify corridors that will link these refugia together, and which will actually enable wildlife and vegetation to move. And clearly there's one here along the Sangre de Cristo Mountains up to the Sawatch Range and Collegiate Peaks and onwards to the north up into Rocky Mountain National Park and other important areas in the state. And we have a couple of other important areas down here originating in the Greenhorn Mountain Wilderness up through the Webb Mountains to the Arkansas River Corridor. Another one here along the Arkansas River Corridor, which we've been doing a lot of work with BLM over the last 4 or 5 years, identifying areas that should be protected. This can actually go either way. I show an arrow going easterly, but actually it could go both east and westerly. And then finally, that Arkansas River corridor going up past Pikes Peak, and then up and through the Lost Creek Wilderness and the Mount Evans Wilderness. So this is kind of where we are with our modeling. It's still very drafty, but we do hope this year to kind of get a final product out, take it on the road to our constituents and to our public land managers and get their input on it as well. So our organization, again, is wildconnections.org. I encourage you to check it out. Feel free to contact me if you're interested, and we'd love to have you join us. Thanks.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you to all of our panelists. We've had a lot of questions come into our question and answer box. And before we get to our first question, I just want to let you know that this session is being recorded and that everyone who has registered will be sent a link to that recording. So I think that was one of our questions, is how you can access that. So my first question to our panelists is, how do you prioritize? This is a topic that I think almost everyone mentioned. How do you prioritize when everything is important? Is there someone who'd like to start with that?
I'll volunteer something. Consistent with what I was saying earlier, it's very hard to approach this in a mechanistic way, thinking that we can take thousands of species and model what's best for each of them and decide which has priority over another. And so I would propose, when dealing with a situation like that, rather than playing favorites or being driven by endangered species necessarily, that we look to maximize the amount of what I'm calling intact nature as one way to handle that overwhelming problem.
Thank you. Anybody want to add to that?
Well, we've talked, this is Nick, we've talked a little bit about the need to change the paradigm. You know, there's an old book out there, I can't remember the author, if some of you will, but you know, the subtitle was Living as If Nature Mattered. And that's the problem. And I know one of the slides talked about how the first thing that comes up in a new project is value in terms of dollars. And we always, and I know a number of resource people, and they tell me their job is basically how can they come up with a reason to say that the effect on wildlife is insignificant or not big enough to challenge the project. And if we do not give wildlife an equal spot at the table or an equal value, things won't change.
Hello, this is Taishya. I would just briefly add, often in the social justice space, there is a phrase we like to, or I often hear used, called the oppression Olympics, which is to say, going back to the how do you prioritize, there's, you know, both are equally as important and are necessary for life, people and the planet. And so, you know, to me, I always defer to community-led, place-based, along with the linkages across, you know, the region. But again, that place-based piece and that community-led piece, I think are two places that I would like to see folks focus on. And again, RUMAP always says with Outdoor Afro that change happens at the speed of relationship. And so, you know, a plan is great, but it's the people that are going to implement it and sustain it. And therefore, again, that collective ownership is going to be critical, where we both, you know, value the lives of all humans as we do all wildlife. Thank you.
Thanks. That sort of leads into my next question, which is, what can individuals do? Some of you are involved as volunteers, some of you professionally, being paid for it, but what can individuals do? And I think that, Taishya, that follows along with what you were talking about as well.
It does, and I saw that question, and you know, I think of that old film, The Power of One. I don't know, it's coming to my mind, but again, just the power of one individual's action and that ripple effect that it has. And so I always say, start in the mirror, looking in the mirror to find out what are the ways at the individual level that you can impact, that you can dismantle those barriers or challenges that we see, whether it be what you pay for at the individual level, what you spend your money on, how you vote, etc. But then there's also making a power map. I always advise, like, how can you use your power, privilege, and platform every day in every way? That is how I mean, I wake up and I'm like, okay, how do I use these amazing privileges that I have and pay it forward. And then another is just learn, unlearn, and relearn. I just finished reading The Undercurrents of Power, the Aquatic Culture of the African Diaspora, and was struck by the fact that Africans were once renowned in canoeing and diving and just all, you know, again, naturalists. And then to wake up being told that Black people don't swim. So that's something I had to unlearn, because I had already learned how to swim as a child. And again, but it's about that relearning and reimagining together. So again, not letting go of the power each individual has to make an impact every single day with the decisions that we make. I'm curious to hear from others on that.
I'd like to say that be active in your home ground. So if you live on the Western Slope, there are organizations there. Great O'Brien's is pretty active on the Western Slope, for instance. If you live in the Central Colorado area, like I was talking about, and are interested, and maybe that's where you recreate and where you live, then work with organizations, conservation organizations on your home ground.
I'll add, I really like the business about looking in the mirror. And even if you live in, say, the suburbs or in the city, you could have a balcony garden with native plants for pollinators, or a hummingbird feeder, or something that will help provide some continuity of habitat, even across densely populated areas. And using your friend network, you can influence them that way too. And the idea should spread that way.
Thanks, everyone. Amanda, to follow up with, we have a question from Betsy that says, what are Amanda's suggestions for how to change our terms? Do you have any specific suggestions?
I think we should probably look at it the way a big corporation would. And I know that that's not really natural for people in the conservation community, but you know, they would dedicate quite a big budget to having a focus group and an advertising firm, and I can't think of the terms they use, but you know, they get together and they have structured meetings and they figure out stuff, and they have deadlines, and they're all going to agree on this and move forward, and they're going to invest a lot of money in a marketing firm. And I think that we need to follow those same sorts of processes, because it's been it's worked very well for the commercial world. And if we're going to be successful in our culture, we just have to adopt the same sorts of practices.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I often lose people when I get into science speak, but I also have an MBA, so understand good marketing is really the name of the game. I just kind of wanted to add that we need to be mindful of our audiences too. So I'm, you know, very mindful of what terms I use with specific communities I'm working with in conservation. One term may fly in one community that won't fly elsewhere. And so, you know, again, good marketing, just know your audience and really think about who you're trying to connect with and communicate with.
I know we're at time, so I want to be mindful of this, but I think that includes, I love this conversation about, you know, as our consciousness, as our understanding evolves, so too does our language need to evolve, right? And, you know, even the term conservation is loaded. And, you know, for indigenous communities as well as African-American communities here specifically, and Asian, Chinese American communities as well. And so, again, knowing that some of these terms that are used neutrally impact people very differently. And so if we want to be inclusive, if we want to extend the bar, we need to revisit all of the terms that may be barriers and actually hurt other people, even though for other people, they're really great words. So again, we must come to and have some tough conversations with ourselves, with our colleagues, with our funders. Again, if we want to be more inclusive, we need to have inclusive language as well. I thank you so much for bringing that up.
Good points. We have another question about how to work with, on the local level, with county and city commissioners to make sure that new housing developments include corridors Would somebody like to address that one?
Well, let me say this from the Western Slope here is that, you know, our county commissioners have actively worked against our local land trust. So that would tell you the type of reception that we get, and basically we don't even try right now. So, you know, when we talk about the need for political engagement, you know, that's pretty important because, you know, in some cases there's an infrastructure. You know, I think in a perfect world, you'd like to be able to talk to some people in those offices who would give a fair hearing. I think there are a number of us around the state who don't have that kind of an opportunity. You know, we have to, you know, we can go and try and pack meetings and so on. People talk about what's the personal thing to do. You know, we have done some of that. We have some good local organizations with paid staff who go to do it. But sometimes, you know, it's a stone wall. It's not a very satisfying answer, but in some cases we need to change some politics.
I know
We've
the
had some-
state,
Go ahead.
excuse me.
Go
I
ahead.
was just going to say, it seems like the state right now is very supportive of the concept of connectivity. And if anything can be done to get that state concern about it to trickle down to the local level, that would be great.
Carl, did you have something to add there?
Oh, yeah, just, well, too quickly, two things. Amanda was probably referring to Governor Polis's executive order on wildlife crossings and so forth. And I think that's a really important, welcome initiative. But we have worked with some county commissioners. We have limited resources. We're a volunteer organization mostly. But with Park County and Chaffee County, we've been able to have some success. Most of our focus is on public lands, but county commissioners are very influential with public land managers. So when they make their big decisions, the feds listen to the counties.
I think there's a really good suggestion here. I don't have experience working much with kind of county and city governments on this topic at hand, but you know, often subdivisions are required to have a certain amount of open space, and kind of a little tweak to make sure that those open spaces connect up, you know, beyond the boundary of the subdivision, I think is a good one, and could get good reception with some counties. And just thinking about the politics, you know, some of the migratory crossing executive orders from this federal administration, Zinke, you know, made a big one, really appealing to the hunting community. You know, you can get some traction there, I guess, but it's challenging for sure.
Carl, did you have something to add?
No.
Okay. Some people are asking questions about the need to create policies and to collect information. I think this plays on things that you can do. Are there policies? We have some people, I think, who are working more at the state level. And do we need to collect that information in terms of what policies are available for habitat connectivity? Taishya or Galen, do either of you have anything to offer on that?
Well, we've mentioned Polis's initiative through Parks and Wildlife. And I think that the counties and the various Parks and Wildlife offices throughout the state are probably, I think they're, and Colorado Department of Transportation as well, are trying to identify where some of those most important crossings can be constructed. So there's certainly policy involvement there.
Right. I mean, and again, I think it's, from my perspective, how then that policy charge becomes implemented. So who's at the decision-making table when we're selecting projects and funding them, and who gets the contracts and all of those things. It also speaks to another of Governor Polis's wildly important goals around ensuring that all Coloradans have access not only to outdoor spaces and wildlife, but also our histories being told and our opportunities to inform and shape our futures.
Let's
Seems
see.
like,
Go ahead, Em.
I was just going to add, it seems like maybe there's a vacuum there and a need for a clearinghouse. There's at least at the state level to collect all of these disparate efforts and policies under one place.
Well, and there's also the Salazar Center for North American Conservation at Colorado State University. They have their connectivity challenge. I had the pleasure of being one of the peer reviewers and read some fantastic applications. And so again, I would add, Amanda, that having that inventory, people are doing so much work, and there is this, even with all this technology and all these databases, there's still this information gap. And so I love that idea of somehow tying not only what's happening in Colorado, but there are implications in other areas, obviously, because the connectivity is just not on our four imaginary boundaries. So again, definitely appreciate that reminder as well, connecting these disparate pieces, connecting each other, the people doing the work.
Mm-hmm.
So along those lines, are there any legislative suggestions from our panelists that would be important, that you see as especially important for the state of Colorado and beyond?
I was just thinking, just from teeing up and thinking about how many important decisions are made at which levels, and starting to be, instead of being in the response, resist mode or reform mode, being in the reimagining space where we are actually helping to identify and support candidates around, who we know align with our work. I mean, I think we've really missed an opportunity. We spend so much on marketing and outreach that we're missing these parts about how do we ensure that people who share our values are at those decision-making tables and are willing to make decisions that value people over profits. And that's, the bottom line, who are willing to go against their self-interest of being comfortable and maintaining the status quo, and really, getting uncomfortable and having these hard conversations that we're all having now. So, again, not just thinking about where we are, but how can we, and already we're seeing the impact that one person, like I think of Tay Anderson over on Denver Public School Board, one person has come in and just really brought up issues that we all knew that we needed to address. That new energy could just change. One person, the power of one.
So it's now 5:09. We're trying to stay on a schedule of ending at 5:30. So I'd like to give each of our panelists, and maybe we'll go backwards. We'll start with Carl this time. And if you would each take about 3 minutes to sort of wrap up, bring any final points you would like to bring, and that may give us a few minutes if we have a couple of questions or something else we need to say. So Carl?
Well, I don't really have anything prepared, but I did jot down a couple of ideas. Someone asked about legislation, another person asked about policies, and you may have gathered that I'm concerned about climate. All this planning about wildlife corridors and with regard to climate change, and Galen's TNC's been doing that as well. It's not going to matter unless we cut back the greenhouse gases. And there are efforts in Congress right now. Just last year, I think the state of Colorado passed the Colorado Climate Action Plan. There are goals in there for reduction of greenhouse gases. So, I mean, I think other people have used this, and I don't want to be trite, but I think, and with all due respect to our racial injustices that are going on right now. I'm completely supportive. But I think the climate is kind of the existential threat to the planet. And unless we all do something soon, it's not going to matter. We're going to lose our agriculture, our water. It's going to be just a really unfortunate scene. So that's my 2 cents on where we're going. I hope that one other thought is a lot of our effort for Wild Connections is focused in the Pike San Isabel National Forest and the BLM lands, also within our geography. The Pike San Isabel is going to have an upcoming forest plan. Supposed to start probably not this year, next year. And that's going to be a major effort for us to try to get our climate refugia and corridors considered in that. So that's kind of where we're headed with Wild Connections. And I'd love to have you join up if you're interested in our home ground.
Thanks, Carl. Amanda?
I also didn't have any thing prepared, but after listening to whatever the other folks have to say and thinking about this, it strikes me that we are at a time nationally of deep self-examination brought about by our shabby response to the coronavirus and the Black Lives Matter movement and the long pandemic. It's forcing us to re-examine some of our basic identities, I think, as a country. And I think it's high time we also throw in the way we've been treating the earth and the prospects. You know, the global warming is unfolding and has been unfolding for quite a while. And so this is a time I don't see a better opportunity for us to throw this in with all of this other national self-examination we're doing. And hopefully from all of these things, a better nation will arise from it. I don't really see another opportunity like this to do the sort of deep reimagination of ourselves and how we live together. I don't think another opportunity is going to come along. So let's throw this one in as well. It's not just a wonky subject of habitat connectivity. It's how we live on this earth and how we get along together on this earth and how we ensure the earth is this wonderful green planet that sustains our life. And so with my small business, I'm trying to interpret nature kind of in that regard for people, a mix of science and kind of reverence, because I think that's what we really need. The science alone isn't carrying it. Thank you.
Thanks. Nick?
Well, I want to, the word I picked up on from something Taishya said about people that sometimes you have to be uncomfortable. You know, I said something about not wanting to talk to our county commissioners because it's like talking to a wall. But you know what? That's just what people need to do. There are a lot of questions out there about what can I do? What can one person do? And we have to get out of whatever our comfort zones are too, and not just talk to groups like this. We may have to go into that congressman's office. You know, I've done it a few times. I don't like it, but you know, we're going to have to be engaged. And that's going to mean, you know, putting yourself out there a little bit. And sometimes it's not that hard. We had a scoping meeting for the new forest plans in this area, and there's like 30 Forest Service people in there, and about 8 of us show up, and they just were dying to talk to somebody. So you may think you don't have much to say because you don't know some of the nuts and bolts and dollars and cents, but if you have a good sense of how the world should be, they still want to hear that. So I encourage everybody to listen. That's listening, don't worry about being uncomfortable, because it's all these subjects we're talking about. What's going wrong is even more uncomfortable. So we have to go out and engage some folks maybe that we don't want to. So that would be my comment.
Thanks. Taishya? We can't hear you, Taishya.
Not having you.
I pushed the button. Okay. The Oppression Olympics has no gold medalists, which is to say, we cannot put people over profits. We cannot put the environment and the planet over people. And so, you know, I really, again, want to emphasize that our economy, our society is based on extraction. Extraction from the planet and extraction from human resources, both of which are bending on their knees right now. And we can act like we are on two different divisions, the AFC and the CLB or whatever those football things are called, or we can act like we are on the same team, the being team that includes wildlife and humans, and come together. And until that happens, we will still face the same division that we are seeing now. And so again, I close with the Oppression Olympics has no gold medalists. Let us all work together as stewards for our planet. Thank you.
Thanks, Taishya. Galen?
All right, well, where to even begin? How to prioritize, right? So, you know, the work we're doing in Colorado and nationally and globally is really focusing in on tackling climate change and protecting land and water, and how can we do both of those things? And there's a lot of tension there, and I see that tension particularly in the landscape I work in Southeast Colorado and the neighboring states around renewable energy development. So how do we go all in for renewable energy development? We've got to do it. We've got to tackle climate change, but also make sure that we are, you know, protecting what matters for us and for nature. You know, I'm a little biased towards grasslands because I work in grasslands, but there are also wonderful places for wind farms and solar facilities, and I get that, but I think people often overlook the real need of protection in anything east of the Rockies. So those are kind of two things that the TNC is really embracing and confronting head on, and is a particular passion of mine. For our new conservation work, we've really been focusing on you know, protecting those areas that will hopefully withstand climate change and climate impacts, so resilient sites, climate corridors. Thank you, Carl, for digging a little more into the weeds about what that might look like. But then also, how do we promote developments like wind energy, like other human developments, to have the lowest impact possible? We've really got to do a both-end approach here, and we've got to get everybody involved in it. It cannot be, you know, a narrow, you know, conservation community going to policy and protection and renewable energy and equity and inclusion. We've got to all come together to do this work and to get the outcomes we've really got to make in the next 10 years. So really appreciate the conversation. Lots of great and difficult questions in the Q&A. We could go for days on them, and it's just been great to be this panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Galen. So I was just made aware that hot off the presses, the Federal Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act just passed in the House. And it includes $300 million for projects to reduce wildlife vehicle collisions nationally, which I think we heard some of that from several of our panelists today. Lots of thanks and appreciation to everyone. I think the sort of the themes that I heard that keep in mind are climate. There are things that we can do individually as well as together about climate. Reverence. I think sometimes we forget to stop and have that reverence. Get out of your comfort zone. It's not comfortable. It's not been comfortable for a while, but it's important. People are important, and we need to have this being team. Climate change, protecting the land and water, and involvement together. And some of the ways those things happen is to vote. We have elections coming up in Colorado. So vote, share your voice that way. as well as vote for environmental friendly candidates. Get involved locally. All of our speakers are involved in local organizations, I think. And so get boots on the ground and have those local involvement. Talk to your friends and family. You're going to make an impact more on those people that you know than anyone else. So talk to your friends and family. It's important to have conversations. Do we have any, let's see, we have a lot of questions. I encourage the panelists to take a minute. Some of you have specific questions in there. And we'll review those, but I want to thank everybody who's participated. Any final remarks from our panelists? Okay, I guess that's a wrap then. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
You.